Okay, I think we'll get started. GP, can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. Yes, we've got the recorded starting. So,
Perfect. All right, let's get started. So, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Kieran John, and I am chair of our Environmental Commission. And I want to welcome you today to what is, I think, the third of our community conversations that we've held over the past year. The other two that we held, the first one was on recycling beyond the basics. And then the other one that we held was on greenscaping and the role of planting native New Jersey plants and the role that that has on our environment. And if you're interested in taking a look at those topics, I encourage you to please go to our borough website where we've housed those videos of those community conversations. But today, the topic of our, if you can go to the next slide, GP, the topic of our conversation today is rainwater solutions for stormwater runoff and clean waterways. So this conversation is really about rainwater more broadly, and specifically how it moves through our community and how it affects our streams and our waterways, and why, as a community, we ought to care about that and what effects that has. And this really is something that we want to try to focus on as an environmental commission in 2026. We want to come back to this a couple of times and approach this from a couple of different angles and go deeper each time we talk about this topic as we go through this year. Today, I think, is really more about setting a foundation and setting a common sort of understanding about how water and the importance of rainwater and how that all connects. So what we want to try to do is to create a common starting point, I think, for a conversation that we will build on as we go through this year. If you can move to the next slide, GP. Let me tell you a little bit about our Environmental Commission. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Environmental Commission here in Pennington. It's a volunteer body. We are made up of residents, community members here, and what we do is we work with Borough Council, we work with the borough staff, and we work with stakeholders within our community, residents and businesses, around matters related to the environment. Now, our role is purely advisory. We are not elected officials in any way, but what the way that I sort of see this, and I think I've explained it in the past, is I see our commission as a conduit. It's a way of communicating between the borough and our community. And when there are important things that we need to communicate from the borough related to the environment, that's an opportunity for us to be involved. But it also works the other way around. We want to be a conduit to convey priorities, challenges, concerns, whatever is top of mind in our community back to the borough and make sure that that's part of a conversation that happens. And there are a variety of different strategic projects and other things that we get into. But that essentially is what we do as a commission. If you could move to the next slide, GP. I just want to acknowledge our commission members. There are 10 of us. As I mentioned, we are volunteers. We are all residents here in Pennington. We come with different perspectives. We come with different backgrounds. Some of us are in the environmental space, deeply in the environmental space. Others are totally unrelated. And I think that creates for a nice dialogue. But one of the things that I want to just highlight here is to really encourage you to please try to attend our Environmental Commission meetings. It happens every month. The commission meeting timing is on our borough calendar, along with the links to join. And we'd love to see you, and if you can spread the word, other people join our meetings as we discuss various topics and strategic projects. We always welcome feedback and participation. If you can go to the next slide, GP. I think I just wanted to convey with this slide that one thing that runs through a lot of our work is the idea that I think environmental outcomes in a town like Pennington in particular is really shaped by individual small decisions. And I think when it comes to a topic like water, I think that's really especially true because water doesn't respect municipal boundaries or it doesn't respect property lines. it happens, on a single property. And when you consider all the properties in Pennington, that's what I think can move the needle. When we decide we want to move in a certain direction together as a community, I think we can begin to implement change. And that's why I think community awareness and a shared understanding about this topic and other topics that's important in our community is so important. And so if we understand together how water flows through Pennington, if we understand why and what choices we make as a community and how that impacts the environment and the wildlife and the flora and fauna in our environment, and I think that can be very powerful, and that's what we're doing tonight. If you can go to the next slide, GP. This, as I mentioned, we act as a conduit. So what we did at the end of, I think it was about a year ago, in December 2024, we conducted a community survey, and we asked in that survey, and hopefully many of you joined and participated in that survey, what was top of mind for you when you thought about the environment in Pennington? And we got a lot of responses. It was a really great survey. We learned a lot about what you feel is important as a community. And this topic around water, runoff, stormwater was one of the topics that ranked highest. And we want to address all of these topics, but we want to particularly spend, as I mentioned, this year focused a little bit more on the topic of water, working with all the stakeholders. So if you move to the next slide, GP, let's talk about today. So this is how we're going to spend our time. I'm going to stop talking in a little bit, and I'm going to turn things over to Brian Friedrich, who will ground us in some basics. And I'll introduce Brian properly, all of the speakers properly as we come to their sections. But Brian's going to ground us, I think, in some of the terminology and some basics around things like what is a watershed? What is stormwater? How does that play as it passes through Pennington? And from there, GP Caminetti, who is our borough administrator, who's on the call, you'll see, we'll talk about this from a borough perspective. What's already happening, what has happened, what is going to happen. And he's going to share at a high level. We're not going to get into specific projects and get into details. That may come at a future interaction that we have. But at a high level, we think it's important that we share that perspective. And then we have invited our good friends from the Watershed Institute, Stuart Tuorto and Olivia Spilduren. And Olivia and Steve are really going to help us understand it. First of all, we're going to step back and look at how Pennington fits within the broader watershed within our region. And then we're going to dive in a little more specifically on what can we do individually as residents, as community members, around this topic, because there's a lot of things that we can do to affect change, and Olivia is going to cover some of that. And then most importantly, or one of the most important goals of today is to leave enough time so that we have some Q&A and we have an opportunity to ask questions, and we all do that. So that's going to be the flow for today. GP, if you could just move to the next slide, please. A few housekeeping things. We are going to be recording today's session so we can play it back at will. So please keep your microphones on mute as much as you can. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, GP will let people in accordingly. Okay, GP, could you move forward? So I'm going to transition now to Brian. Brian is the managing engineer at One Water Consulting. And I'm reading his bio here. He has over 20 years of experience in the field of water resource engineering. His focus has been on stormwater management, watershed planning, ecological restoration, and wastewater treatment. And Brian is a registered professional engineer in New Jersey and has been a member of the Pennington Borough Environmental Commission for quite a while, since I think 2019. And of course, Brian is a resident within Pennington, so he's one of our neighbors. So with that, Brian, let me transfer over to you if you want to take control of the screen, and we can move through your section. Thank you.
Okay, great. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yep, we can see you perfect.
Fantastic. So yes, I am going to kind of set the stage today, talking about what is stormwater, what is watersheds, runoff basics. And kind of set the stage for some more detailed discussions later on from the Watershed Institute folks. I am a managing engineer at One Water Consulting. I'm also a Pennington Borough resident, and environmental commission member. So today I'm going to talk about watersheds and what they mean and what watersheds there are in Pennington Borough. I'll talk about stormwater runoff and stormwater management, how stormwater impacts our community. Then I'll talk about ways that you can go about improving stormwater management, improving water quality and quantity. And then just mention a couple local stormwater initiatives that we're working on. So what exactly is a watershed? It's an area of land that drains or sheds water into a particular stream, river, pond, or lake, any surface water. It's shaped by natural topography as well as the built environment, and it's driven by water cycle processes, things like rainfall, infiltration, runoff. One thing I wanted to point out on this slide is the watershed divide. The divide is a ridge or high point that separates two adjacent watersheds to different bodies of water. So it basically divides the flow of water between two different watersheds that go to two different water bodies. And in general, within a watershed, water moves from the upstream areas, which are the headwaters of the watershed. They go into small tributaries, then into larger streams, larger rivers, and bodies of water downstream. So in Pennington Borough, there are two main watersheds. We're kind of lucky that we are located right on a major watershed divide. It goes right through the middle of Pennington, but stormwater in the southwestern portion of Pennington Borough drains to Woolsey Brook, which then goes into Jacobs Creek and eventually the Delaware River. And then stormwater in the northern and eastern portions of Pennington Borough drain to the Stony Brook, which then flows into the Millstone River and the Raritan River, eventually going all the way out to Raritan Bay. So it's kind of cool to think about how precipitation on one side of Little Pennington goes all the way out to the Raritan Bay, and then the other side goes the exact opposite direction to the Delaware River. The Jacobs Creek watershed, which includes Woolsey Brook, that's about 196 acres. That's the smaller watershed, and the Stony Brook watershed drains 879 acres in Pennington Borough. So what exactly is stormwater? Stormwater is water that originates from any type of precipitation event. So, most people would think about rainfall, but it can also be snowmelt, like we had plenty of out there today. It's a natural part of the water cycle. It's runoff that would occur even in a totally undeveloped forested watershed. However, in urban and suburban areas that are developed with impervious coverage, there can be too much of this water for streams and drainage systems to handle, which can cause issues downstream with flooding. Stormwater also carries pollutants with it in these urbanized areas downstream, which can negatively impact water quality, aquatic habitat, and even drinking water sources. So impervious cover is really important when we're thinking about stormwater runoff. The more impervious cover you have, the more stormwater runoff will occur. And this is a really big impact. So you can see there's a figure here that shows as you get up to 30% to 50% impervious cover, you start to see a lot more runoff, like 3 times the amount of runoff that you would have in a natural watershed. So some of these impacts of development, you get this increased runoff and increased, more frequent flooding. But you also have to think about portion of water that goes into the ground. So as you have more impervious surfaces, less water makes its way into the soils and down into the groundwater. So this really changes the overall water cycle, increasing runoff, increasing flooding, and reducing that amount of groundwater that gets down, the water that gets down into the groundwater. So taking this one step further, the climate is also changing with more frequent and more intense storm events. And I'm sure this is something that everyone has noticed. And there's a figure here that shows, from 1972 to 2010, changes in land cover with more impervious coverage from developed lands in New Jersey. And then you also see in these figures changes in precipitation. Especially in the Northeast, we've seen much higher precipitation events as the climate changes. So you end up seeing a lot more rain, a lot more impervious coverage, more frequent storms. That all leads to more runoff and more frequent flooding, which we have seen, unfortunately, in Pennington Borough. So these are just some pictures from around the area. Some of these you will likely recognize. On the top left, there's a picture of flooding at Route 31 and Delaware Avenue. The bottom left is a picture of the parking lot at Uncle Ed's, flooding in that location. Flooding at Route 1 near the 295 interchange there. Flooding in Princeton, flooding in Trenton. So we've seen in the last 10, 20 years a big increase in the frequency and size of these flooding events in our community. In addition to the flooding concerns, water quality is also a big issue that we need to be paying attention to. So the stormwater runoff from these urbanized areas carries with it pollutants that can cause impairments to surface waters like streams and lakes downstream. And this is a list of some of the impairments that we see in the watersheds around us. Things like pathogens, nutrients. When there's phosphorus and nitrogen nutrients that are carried downstream, they can cause issues with the health of a water body and even lead to issues like harmful algal blooms. That's associated with issues with dissolved oxygen. When you have overgrowth of algae and plant material in waterways, you get big swings in dissolved oxygen, which can harm aquatic life. And then suspended solids. So as you have more flow going into our waterways and streams, they really can't handle that big increase in runoff that they are not really designed for naturally. And you end up having erosion of stream banks, which can cause sediment to be brought downstream and pollution to be brought downstream. So now that I've gone through the issues around flooding and water quality, what are some ways that we're looking at to improve water quality and flooding in our communities? What are some of the options, tools in our toolbox? One of the most common types of technologies out there is called green infrastructure. And it's a more advanced type of stormwater management than kind of an old traditional approach. And these are best management practices that are intended to mimic the natural system, natural hydrology. So instead of like a large detention basin with a concrete low flow channel that just holds water, we're now trying to mimic the natural hydrologic conditions by infiltrating stormwater runoff, by using vegetation to soak up runoff, and trying to really manage that quantity of stormwater instead of just holding back the stormwater. These technologies also have a big improvement for water quality. And some examples are rain gardens, pervious pavement systems, different types of infiltration systems, stormwater wetlands. They're all different types of examples that the speakers later in this session will go into more details about. Some other tools that we have is simply disconnecting impervious cover. So you might have a driveway that goes directly into the street, or you might have roof runoff that's piped directly to the street. How do we disconnect that runoff from those impervious surfaces and get it to run over pervious areas that can then get a chance to infiltrate into the ground? We also are looking at retrofitting existing stormwater basins. So there's lots of stormwater basins around that are kind of these more older traditional technologies that can be retrofitted to perform a lot better. So that's something that we're looking at. Also, stream restoration activities, stabilizing stream banks, lake restoration, planting riparian zones with native vegetation are options to improve stormwater management. There's also some options for enhancing stormwater ordinances and dealing more with source control, like street sweeping, waste management, storm drain maintenance, et cetera. And then finally, greenscaping. How do we manage our lawns better to soak up stormwater runoff? And there's a whole community conversation that happened at the end of last year that's available online on greenscaping. So I won't go into too much detail on that. Just some pictures of these green infrastructure technologies. These are different projects that I've worked on in the past or are at sites in the area. The constructed wetlands, top left is a picture of that. Simply using vegetated conveyance swales instead of pipes is a great way to help improve stormwater runoff, reduce the quantity of runoff going downstream. There's pervious pavement systems. We no longer have to design all of our roadways around impervious surfaces. We can actually use pervious surfaces for those areas. There's a picture of a rain garden in the bottom right. I'll go into that in a little more detail. And then green roofs, that's a little less common technology, but that is a picture of the Watershed Institute, which does have a green roof. As well as cisterns. How do we hold that stormwater runoff from roofs and use it for other purposes? That could be as simple as a rain barrel, for example, at a home. So I mentioned rain gardens. This is one of the better technologies out there, especially for homeowners who want to better manage stormwater on their properties. But it's a landscaped shallow depression that's designed to intercept, treat, and infiltrate stormwater at the source before it becomes runoff. Native plants are used in the rain gardens to help retain pollutants. There's a picture here on the bottom right. That's actually at Timber Lane Middle School. There is a demonstration rain garden that was installed there along the parking lot. And then I just wanted to mention there is a rain garden manual that you can find online of New Jersey that was put together by Rutgers University. This is a graphic from that, but there's some really good design guidelines if you're looking to implement rain gardens on your property. Retrofitting detention basins is something that we're looking at in Pennington Borough. And these are areas where we have kind of these older traditional detention basins with a concrete low flow channel, not a lot of water quality treatment happening during small storm events. Most of that water just goes right down that concrete channel and out the outlet structure. How do we use that infrastructure that's already there and improve it with native vegetation, rain garden pockets, improve the soils to infiltrate more, to get more out of these systems that are already in the ground? And that's something we're looking at in the community to better manage stormwater runoff. So going a little more into these local stormwater initiatives, what's Pennington Borough doing to plan for the future? Right now, Pennington Borough is involved with a group, a regional watershed planning group with the Stony Brook watershed towns. And this is a group that's doing a watershed management plan to look at the characteristics of the overall watershed, the different sub-watersheds, and how they impact flooding and water quality, and looking at what types of projects can be implemented throughout these towns to improve water quality, reduce the impairments to water quality, and reduce flooding in our communities. I also wanted to mention that the Watershed Institute completed some impervious cover assessments, including Pennington Borough was part of that. Pennington Borough has an impervious cover assessment. In that report, there's a bunch of proposed projects. So that's a really good resource for Pennington Borough to look at for implementing projects in our community. Right now, the Watershed Institute is planning for a pervious pavement and green infrastructure demonstration project at their site. So that, once it's constructed, will be a really great resource to take a look at different types of green infrastructure and pervious pavement that can be used. And then finally, Pennington Borough is involved with a coalition to look at flooding at Route 31 and Delaware. This is being led by Mercer County and their planning department, as well as DVRPC, which is the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. And this is looking at stormwater that is draining to the intersection of Route 31 and Delaware, and how it can be better managed to reduce flooding at that intersection. So with that, I will turn it over to GP, our borough administrator, to get his perspective from the borough.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. I really appreciate you going through that and teeing that up. I mean, you talked about how stormwater works, how it shows up in different parts of town. So I think the natural question now is, as we think about our community and our borough, what are we doing to help manage this? And you've touched on a couple of those, but we wanted to give GP an opportunity also to share some of his thoughts. And just for those that may not be familiar with GP is our borough administrator. And GP really oversees a lot of the day-to-day municipal operations in our borough and coordinates across departments. He works with council. He works with the staff that he oversees to implement the policies and make sure things are running smoothly. So we're very lucky to have him part of our community. And GP, can I turn it over to you to say a few words?
Certainly, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, Kieran, and welcome everyone. It's good to see so many people coming out. We have 32 participants tonight, 5 panelists, and 27 members of the public who are interested in taking up their time. So I appreciate that. I'll try to be brief, and the good news is that I don't have any slides to share with you. So I will be walking you through a couple of key points in the way that Kieran began to describe. And hopefully, by the time I finished with my contribution to tonight's information evening, you'll get a better understanding of how we are working in terms of local government on your behalf, on all of our behalves, to really manage the stormwater challenge that we have in our municipality and beyond. So let me start by saying that if you'll recall the map that Brian just showed us, Pennington is a tiny donut community surrounded on all sides by Hopewell Township, and Watershed doesn't originate in Pennington Borough, which means that water largely flows into the borough, flows through the borough, and then flows out of the borough. But nevertheless, it's our responsibility to manage those flows and not try to contribute to increased or unnecessary flows casually. So we look at these things very carefully. And when I say that your local government, your elected officials are working on this, let me just sketch out very quickly what our roles are in local government. As Kieran had indicated, I'm responsible for operations. Okay, the governing body, those you elect, you don't elect me to office, I'm hired by the elected officials. Those you elect are responsible for policies of the borough, for local ordinances or laws, and general directions in the form of a master plan that gets revised every 10 years. And then it trickles through to me and operations and all of the departments that make that magic happen. We also have the interface, not only with our local issues, but we also interface with the outside world. So there are regulations and rules that we need to comply with that come from the state, that come from sometimes the federal government, sometimes the county. So we operate within a larger framework. It's not a vacuum. So what we do is important. We need to be mindful of our neighbors. Some things we have no jurisdiction over. What we can control, we try to do in a way that's cautious, responsible, and very much focused on long-term sustainability of not only the properties in the borough, but also the residents and their well-being and health while we live here. So that having been said, policy can be affected in many ways on a local level through things like looking at redevelopment sites. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the landfill site, the former landfill that's been closed for decades now, but is in need of redevelopment. And for those who have been studying stormwater flows through town, it's no secret that a lot of the stormwater that comes into town and causes trouble for residents in town comes through that location from Route 31 and beyond. From the township, that's a large source of stormwater that comes into the borough. So we're looking at redevelopment policies for that site to think about what the most intelligent and sustainable way could be or should be to slow down the flows or encourage infiltration, all of the things that Brian was describing very clearly to us. And so that's one example. Another example for less immediately impacted areas of the borough would be zoning. The zoning rules and regulations. What are you allowed to build on your property? How much impervious coverage? What we call the floor to area ratios. How much are you allowed to do? What happens when you do put up more impervious coverage? Where does the water channel to? We have ordinances, for example, preventing sump pump discharge into storm drains. You're not allowed to do that. That used to be allowed in the past. So there are a bunch of things that we do on a local level in terms of policy to not only facilitate better cooperation with outside agencies, the county, the state, Department of Environmental Protection and the like, but also to help us reduce the origination of stormwater within the borough, not just what comes through the borough. So we look at all of these things concurrently, and as you can imagine, it can get complex in a hurry because you have competing interests, you have people who have more or less of an effect on stormwater generation. And we have competing concerns that we have to manage in a way that's intelligent and efficient. Let me give you some examples, because it's not just about policy considerations and making decisions in meetings, but it's also about where the rubber hits the road and concrete operations. I'll mention stormwater management, of course, as a stormwater utility. Drinking water. We have a water utility in town. We also have to manage sewer flows to the sewage utility and to the treatment plant, which means that all of these things need to be carefully monitored and maintained. You may recall when we had leaf season in the fall, that Public Works is always focused very, very directly on getting the leaves collected as quickly as possible to prevent them from going into the storm drains, which would in turn restrict flow and cause trouble in stormwater management as storm drains are restricted in their function. We try to avoid anything that might negatively impact our watershed. We talk about infiltration. If infiltration is not managed properly, then we also look at the very real prospect of having a negative impact to our aquifer, which is where all of our drinking water comes from. We have wells in town that pump the water up for our use, for residential use, not only drinking water, but also for things like fire suppression. So we need to manage all of these different elements of operations, public works, stormwater management basins on some of the older basins in the way that Brian was describing, the older generations. We are actually compelled by the Department of Environmental Protection to report on privately held basins. So places like Brandywine and the like, these are privately held properties with retention basins that are out of compliance with the newest standards and may or may not be maintained as well as they could or should be. And we still have to report on behalf of the private property owners to the DEP to maintain compliance with environmental regulations as they're written and as they apply now. So I hope this is not confusing, but it is complex, and I just wanted to give you a feel for some of these operations. Let me just quickly touch upon two further points, and then I'll hand off to the next speaker. None of this happens in a vacuum, and each of these individual tiles can be put together to form a larger mosaic or a larger picture of total stormwater management in the borough. So this is also directly linked to public safety. So our operations, not only our policies, our operations regarding police, fire, rescue, all of the public works people, keeping them out of harm's way. Water starts running quickly. You saw the slide, the image that Brian showed before of the intersection of Route 31 and Delaware Avenue. Keeping people out of those intersections in cars, pedestrians, all of these things are mission critical, and we have to focus on them to protect our residents. These things require training, resources, equipment, staff, all of these things, which in turn affects the budget. And as you all know, and you know where this is going, the budget has a direct link to your taxes. So all of these things do not occur independently of one another, but they're all interlinked and interconnected in a very complex mosaic. But the bottom line can be summarized very succinctly. All of it is important. All of it is important. So I want to just share with all of you that these concerns are very much at the forefront of what the governing body, in terms of policy and intelligent policy, and also facilitating cooperation with other agencies, the county, the state, Department of Environmental Protection, and the like, very much at the forefront of their concerns, thinking, and priorities, and also the operations, all of those activities that I just described and more that trickle down from the policies. So I hope that helps to get a feel for what we're doing to support the management of stormwater going forward. And one last thing that I should add, and this is no small thing either, is that we are absolutely grateful and dependent for the work that you do. Participants who come to the meetings, the volunteers on the Environmental Commission, those who put together the survey, those who responded to the survey, those who come and voice their opinions and let us know if these efforts are being recognized or if there's something that we're missing, overlooking. This is critical, this level of partnership going through all levels of the borough. And I'm proud and honored to be a part of it. So thank you, Kieran.
No, thank you, GP. I think that was perfect. And, a lot of the work that our municipal team does often goes unseen by the average person, and they do tremendous work for us. There's a lot of work to do, but there's a lot that they have done, and we're very grateful to them. And so I think at this point now we've heard Brian has talked about how stormwater shows up locally, and GP's talked about how the borough approaches this from a planning and coordination standpoint. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to introduce Steve and Olivia to talk to us a little bit about the broader context of the watershed. Steve will ground us in how Pennington fits into the regional watershed and the excellent work they do. And then Olivia is going to bring it back to an individual level and talk about some of the practical actions that we can all do as residents and community members on our own properties collectively. So let me introduce Steve. Steve is the Director of Science and Stewardship at the Watershed Institute. He manages a lot of different research programs, projects that are central to supporting the Institute's mission to promote better stewardship of our natural resources. And this includes overseeing local, regional, statewide, and interstate programs. So we're very grateful that Steve has joined us today. And Olivia's role is as a river-friendly coordinator. So she works with residents, with schools, with businesses to increase the overall environmental literacy about this topic and to promote behavioral change, which is what we want ultimately to happen here. And she has got a lot of experience actually implementing all of the things that she's going to talk about that we can do as individuals, as families, as community members in Pennington. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve to take us through his thinking and share his perspective. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Kieran, GP, and Brian as well. Can everybody hear me and see my slides? Excellent. Yeah, I'm just going to show these really quickly because we have upcoming our annual watershed conference, ninth one. We run this in partnership with the DEP, and their topics for all peoples, whether you're in an agency, for your government, for residential purposes, looking for education. Go to the website. There's one full day of virtual programming on the 26th. And then on the 27th, we have one full day in person there with the hybrid option, but that takes place at TCNJ, and it's a really great day. You learn a lot. Go to thewatershed.org or find the link there at the bottom when we share this for more info, the agenda. And I think if you look at the agenda and the speakers, you find a lot of neat tools for looking more into what we're doing. Everything from regulatory to action. So a lot of what I will cover here, a lot of what we're all covering here sort of overlaps. So I hope we're taking it one level further each time here. This is a slide I love and an animated GIF I love to use because it really is very visual way of thinking of watersheds as I think of Russian nesting dolls because watersheds are just ever increasing or ever decreasing in size, and until you meet that common water body that the water sheds to, and that goes right down to our very own residences, our own property, or even where you're standing in the yard. Like wherever you dump water and it flows, you're in a watershed. And so I'll try to bring that into perspective a little bit pretty quickly, and we can talk more with questions at the end. But if we look statewide in New Jersey. And we divide the state up into those geographically driven watersheds, as Brian described. We have 20 different watershed management regions, watershed management areas. We call them WMAs. List this here. You can kind of just search that on the internet if you want. New Jersey's watershed WMAs, if you want to see what they are. Pennington is in WMA 10, and partially, just a tiny piece of it is in 11, as we saw. As we start to shrink down, if we look inside of that WMA 10 and 11, then we start to see, so this is Raritan area. We fall into that one, and start to look at the actual streams. But everything that falls on most of Pennington and everything else in the Raritan area, just like Brian said, drains eventually here to Raritan Bay. And then there's that tiny bit of Pennington that ends up in the Delaware. Shrinking down even more, you can think even more regionally, zooming in, and for as an example, I'm just showing you sort of. So as Kieran said, we have a lot of statewide and even interstate initiatives, but if we were to say where we do our actual actions and regionally focused work, it's still a pretty broad area, but this is what it boils down to. It's sort of this Stony Brook section of the Millstone, the lower Millstone section of the Millstone area. So it's an awful lot of central Jersey, even parallel over across into the Delaware. So everywhere from West Amwell, the most northern part of Lambertville, all the way down to Bordentown and within the watershed. And there's Pennington, right? So there's that little bit that's in the Delaware. There's with the rest feeding to the Stony Brook. But as Brian was saying, I did want to show in a little bit more detail, just to make it a little bit more intuitive, how these things have watershed boundaries that obviously don't recognize, which I love how everyone's saying over and over again, they don't recognize boundaries of ownership, right? Municipal boundaries, or even your neighbor's boundaries. The water's going to run where it's going to run. So in green here, we have the Stony Brook. Again, here's Pennington. And, even though Pennington, the majority of Pennington and Hopewell Borough are in, drain to the Raritan Basin, that's WMA 10 for the most part. You see that Hopewell Borough is not in the Stony Brook at all. I mean, it's right there, right? You just drive right over there, but you're actually, Hopewell Borough ultimately drains to, the very lower end of the Millstone, whereas Pennington goes to the Stony Brook and which drains into the Millstone just above Carnegie Lake, right? So it's just to kind of put that kind of thing into perspective. And obviously here the black is the municipal boundaries. Over here we leave the municipal boundaries in, but we put in those watershed lines, that next level of watershed perimeter or boundary or common draining areas. They're designated, they have a designation of, we call them HUC 14s if you work with watersheds a lot. And that just means common areas that drain to common points within a larger watershed, basically. So these lines basically are all, defining these little larger chunks of just the Stony Brook watershed alone. And you see even those don't pay any attention to ownership of boundary ownerships, right? Perimeters. So this purple in here, just to kind of drive that home for even our watershed reserve where the institute is, that whole purple section is our reserve. And you see the very top of it kind of breaks out of the Stony Brook and into that section of the Millstone that would be considered lower Millstone, not even upper Millstone. This is just another way of looking, pardon me, at that figure that Brian shared, just to give it some natural background, show how most of this goes, most of Pennington goes towards the Delaware. And there's this little piece, and it's not unique, but it is an interesting position, right? And GP mentioned that, just to rephrase what GP said, like everybody's downstream or upstream of somebody, right? And so, I do commend Pennington for thinking that way, for being part of some of the regional work that we're doing and the partnerships we're doing to get work done, because it's the only way to really manage things properly. And at the end of the day, you get it done right and you get it done at a more cost efficient way. But this section of Woolsey Brook is really considered the headwaters of Woolsey Brook. So if I'm going to zoom into that, right, here's the Timberlane Middle School and the high school, HVCHS, and then over here's the Pennington School. And it's that stormwater pond, more or less, on the Pennington School that is the upper portion. The headwaters is right in the headwaters of Woolsey Brook, and it drains this way across 31. And it has a slightly bigger drainage area, so that's the Woolsey Brook proper than this drainage area that comes off of the school properties here, which makes that whatever drains from here to go to a tributary, quote unquote, of the Woolsey Brook. But this is the Woolsey Brook main stem that drains from Pennington. And when you're in the headwaters of any part of a stream, you have a particular obligation to its water quality, because if that is ruined, then anything that is not doing well downstream cannot ever recover, right? That's the source of your fresh, clean water. Luckily, Pennington and the Pennington School in particular are really good stewards of their land. They're conscious of this. So again, all of not all of, and I'll show that in a minute, but there's a large portion of the schools over here that hit one of the other major tributaries to Woolsey Brook. And I just want to drill down in on this and use the school, because this is just another unique situation. This, Timberlane and the high school are in the same position as all of the Pennington Borough, right? They have this big divide between the Delaware and the WMA 10, which is Stony Brook Millstone. And it goes right down the middle of their buildings, right? So this is just to put kind of ownership of one piece of property in perspective, and it can be any one of our houses. But essentially, to kind of simplify things, this whole section of the Timberlane Middle School eventually drains to this detention basin out here, which kind of makes it, we can call it the TMS, the southern TMS watershed, if you will, right? So that's where the water that hits here drains to commonly. So that's its watershed. The upper portion of it drains elsewhere and ultimately goes into the Stony Brook, which essentially means that half the school drains to an entire different part of the ocean eventually, right? And that's kind of an interesting thing to do. It's something I love to bring to the schools and show what's going on, just to kind of drive home what's going on there. But I do want to scroll through this exercise really quickly to just drive home that Russian nesting doll thing, right? So here's that TMS watershed. Where does it go? It drains to a pipe eventually, but then eventually hits streams that are tributaries. Each one of those streams has a drainage area, so each one of those are just other watershed boundaries. As you follow down that branch, there's just more and more and more of those. Here's the Timberlane Middle School one. Here's those three I brought up at first. And as you go down, there's that version of a sub watershed all the way down, right? And this looks like a lot. It all feeds to a common water body, this stream here. So they're all they're all sub watersheds of that bigger watershed. We zoom out some more. This is the section we just went over, right? There's the Timberlane Middle School, and there's a whole bunch of those, right? This is the one that actually comes from the Pennington School. There's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. They all go to a common water body, right? This big stream. And since they all drain to the Woolsey Brook, they're all part of the Woolsey Brook watershed, right? And we can just keep zooming out from there, opening our rushing nesting dolls. Here's the Woolsey Brook watershed. Here's another watershed, smaller size, but sort of same level of drainage. And then there's this other branch over here that's even bigger than Woolsey Brook, and it has a whole bunch of its own versions of those watersheds within watersheds. And because that branch and drainage area in general is bigger than the Woolsey Brook, we call it the Jacobs Creek watershed. We say that Woolsey Brook is a major tributary to the Jacobs Creek watershed. So here, continuing to zoom out, here's Timberlane Middle School watershed. You can see it's right on this one divide that drains from one part of the ocean to the other, right? Here's Jacobs Creek. Here's Woolsey Brook. Here's Ewing Creek, another larger tributary to the Jacobs Creek. All of this makes it Jacobs Creek. And because it drains to right here, it's all part of this watershed, which is the Delaware River at that point. And like if we zoom back out, look how tiny that piece is, right? It seems like very small things adding up to big things, but when you zoom back out, look, it's part of this greater thing right here, which happens to be, a larger division of the Delaware watershed. And all of that in that little tiny dot, which has so much impact in so many of our lives and we are stewards of, is the Jacobs Creek. But in the grand scheme of things, it's just really cool to put those in perspective and to even zoom out further, right? We have 5 states that are stewards of the Delaware watershed, right? And they're all made up of of 1,000 Jacobs Creeks and is ultimately the drinking water for something like 16 million people, right? So that's just about perspective. Jacobs Creek. Brian already went over really well how the watershed interacts with, or the water cycle sort of governs watersheds, and how hardscaping and development has sort of turned the natural watershed into more of what sometimes we'll call the urban watershed, how that causes runoff, how pollutants are included with that, et cetera. And so I'm just going to show some things to kind of drive it home a little bit. So here's some real data. This is New Jersey's annual precipitation totals. This is why when you're looking at things like this, you do need some long-term data to really know if the trends we think are happening. But this is true average totals for New Jersey, pretty much since we've been keeping records. This is all the way up until I think it's, I got it right on there. No trick questions, 2022. And even though we have the variability as years go, this is quite a bit of rain increase over time. Doesn't look big, right? But it averages out to be roughly 3.5 inches of extra water since we began keeping records in any given year falling in New Jersey. 3.5 inches doesn't sound like a lot. But it actually, if it all fell on New Jersey all at once, it's 530 billion gallons, right? If you know Round Valley Reservoir, that's New Jersey's biggest reservoir. It holds 550 million gallons. So that extra 3.5 inches in any given year can fill up our biggest reservoir roughly 10 times. So just as to put that into some perspective. Here's some data that shows the difference between between watersheds that are impacted, that are affected or that are urbanized versus ones that aren't. So this line right here is what we would like to see. And full disclosure, I made that one up. That's not real data, but it is a pretty good approximation of what a really healthy watershed should do, right? Water should hit, it should get intercepted by an awful lot of vegetation and natural lands. A lot of it, most of it should go in the ground. All the rest of it should be intercepted, taken up by plants, transpired, evaporated, and like Brian showed, about 10% of it during the heaviest rains and the wettest parts of the year should run off. And when it does that, it runs through our landscape slowly. And this healthy base flow keeps your streams at a certain point. But when we get a big storm, it takes a while for it to reach that stream. It's slowed down. It's also cleaner. We're not talking about that here. The base flow of that stream should go up to a certain point, but with some lag time, and it should also take a while for that stream to go back down. But as we build more and more and more, this is real data. These are two graphs of discharge. So how much volume of water is passing any given point in the stream at any given point in time. So it's cubic feet per second. We call that discharge. So this is two streams in the same watershed receiving the same amount of rain in a storm. And these are the hydrographs for that. So here we have sort of a moderately developed but rural part of that watershed. And this is what the hydrograph looks like for that. So we see a lot less lag than I'm hopeful for, quite a bit bigger crest and a pretty big drop off here. Right. But if we check out the really urbanized side of that town, getting the same amount of rain and just a slightly, in a tributary just off to the side of it, that water hits the ground, hits the stream, and blows out the stream and is gone just as quickly. And what this does is essentially, I'm just enumerating what Brian showed. If we have too much water hitting the ground and hitting the streams too quickly, we have flooding. If we have too much water running off, period, that means it's not going into the ground, which means when we're not flooding, we have drought, right? Our groundwater is being depleted, and if it's carrying all the pollutants with it, our water is always dirty too, right? This is just a graph showing another thing. I'm going to speed along here just to try and catch up on some time. A healthy watershed has a lot of infiltration. An urban one doesn't. And if it's not going into the ground, that means it's running off and causing flooding. And if it's not going into the ground, it means that we're not recharging our aquifers. So those are two big consequences that we tend not to think of it. The other one is just flat out, and a lot of the pollutant loading that we associate, or the pollution we associate with our water bodies, are just due to habitat degradation. So yes, stuff runs off of our managed lands and into the streams, and that contributes to our pollutant loading or water body impairment. But streams don't look like this, they shouldn't naturally. They should have they should have some shape to it. They should have some habitat, some diverse habitat. They should have certain types of bottoms for aquatic life and for in-stream processes, which is 2 lectures all in and of itself. But what we have when we have these types of hydrographs right here is this. We just excise and cut the banks of the stream. We disconnect them from their floodplains and their natural riparian zones. That's if they have a natural and healthy riparian zone or floodplain. It's now disconnected. And what that does is exacerbate flooding, right? Because it takes a lot more water for this to be able to break the banks. But when it does, it's so much that it overflows and floods. But where is all this sediment going? And whatever's involved with this sediment, it's going downstream and it's smothering habitat, etc.
Hey,
Um,
Steve.
yeah,
Uh, if we could jump to the slide you have about the green infrastructure and neighborhoods, I think that
yeah,
would be good.
absolutely. So this is just me pointing out this is work that we do. Brian already talked about it to kind of come up with this stuff. Here we have like we do an assessment, we go in and we try to replace. This is a naturalized detention basin that we did in Hopewell Borough, like Brian was talking about. So now when the water comes in, we cut out some of the channel so it feeds into the sediments and feeds the plants rather than going directly to the stream. We did that for an entire stretch of Hopewell Borough. And so this is a really good example of what can be done in an urbanized area, in a developed area, residential or business. We went in and did a whole bunch of projects along East Broad Street. Um, Pennington Borough is involved with us and a lot of collaborators, as Brian talked about, in developing watershed management plans. The reason we were able to get funding to do this in Hopewell Borough is because there was a watershed management plan in place there and some assessments in place already. So it's really good that you guys are involved in that. This is what some of those projects look like. This was a drainage ditch outside of what used to be Brick Farm Market, and we turned it into a bioswale. And so water that leaves that parking lot basically leaves this, almost never is seen leaving that parking lot. So this is dry while there's tons of runoff. The other thing I wanted to show, so that's sort of town, commercial and private lands throughout a main strip of town. This is a really good residential example. That's not ours, but it was a really good example of where good data was collected in, where was this? Minnesota. In Burnsville, Minnesota, and they took a development, much like we have around here, and they separated one as a control and one as a treatment, where they measured the stormwater leaving the area during storms before and after. They put in 15 or 17 different rain gardens just in the lawns of the houses in this development. So these are similar, like how much stormwater is leaving at any given point in time, those two neighborhoods with the control neighborhood in blue and the neighborhood that got rain gardens in red before they put the rain gardens in. They're not the same, but they're changing pretty proportionate to each other, which makes them a good comparison. And here's what it looked like after they put the rain gardens in, just in those houses. And people will say, like, rain gardens are not the answer. You can't fix everything. And that's true. But look at the difference it made just in this neighborhood. Okay, with that, I'll pass it over to Olivia.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening to us be nerds about watersheds. I think you've heard the word watershed enough tonight, so I'll try not to say it again. We will talk more about plants, all the things that are going in to those green infrastructure projects to help the watershed. So the next slide. I won't go into all of these again because we've talked a lot about, but this is again a layout of some green infrastructure, some stormwater management projects that you can do at home, whether it's using water conservation techniques like rain barrels, construction by using pervious pavement, or more naturalized options like gardens, trees, meadows, or riparian buffers. So if you click, yeah, trees are often, people don't realize, I definitely didn't realize until I was working in this job, just how much water that trees drink up in a year. So as Steve said about, a couple extra inches of precipitation a year is going to put a lot of billions more gallons of water down onto our land. So these trees are really important. For example, a mature northern red oak in a year can drink up around 23,000 gallons of water. So keeping those trees that we have healthy and happy is, the best option. But of course, planting more trees to be able to take over for those trees when they pass away naturally is a great thing to do. So why use native plants? I heard you have had talks on this before, but just to reiterate, native plants are adapted to the New Jersey climate because they've been around. We usually say plants are native if they've been in this area since before colonization, so the 1500s. So it's been centuries, maybe even millennia, that they've been uh, adapting to this climate, adapting to the creatures that live here. Um, you can click more, Steve. Yeah, so you can see that many native plants have much longer root systems than their non-native counterparts. Non-native plants can also often be annual plants or plants that are from places that don't need deeper root systems. But native plants, they have these really deep systems of roots that help them in a couple ways. So one, it helps to keep soil together to prevent erosion. It can help them survive a drought by being able to dig deep into the soil to get to water that's deep in the soil. But it can also help with stormwater management by being those straws that pull the runoff down into the ground and store it and recharge our aquifers. If you click again, you can also see that native plants have a lot of wildlife benefits. So these are creatures that have co-evolved with these plants, need these plants. The creatures need the plants need the creatures. If you click one more time, yep, you'll see there's lots of different colors and types, and they bloom all throughout the 3 of 4 seasons. So you'll have something all all year long. And then finally, there's another fun picture that I found just showing the biodiversity you can add to even a little patch of lawn just by adding more native plants and taking away the traditional turf grass lawn. You can see how a lawn will create kind of a food chain. So there's grass, there's a bug that eats the grass, there's a bird that eats the bug. You know, it's a chain, it's a one singular line versus if you add native plants, if you add diversity of plants, you get a diversity of creatures living in your area. So one way that we can manage stormwater is by just creating less turf grass. So you could create something that you'd call like a low mow area where you just don't mow the grass for a certain amount of time to allow it to be able to, not need as many inputs. Or you can add native plants into that and create meadows. Of course, check with your local ordinances and have signage and educate your neighbors so they don't think you just forgot to mow your lawn. Yep, we can move on to the next one. Rain gardens, we've already hit home with this a lot, so we can just keep clicking through to a local example. This is a rain garden location in Hightstown, New Jersey. We worked with a community group called Rise with their high school students, and they identified this section that you can see here that typically isn't massive flooding, but is kind of an eyesore and is just a place for improvement. So if you click the next one, you can see that we did the excavation at that site, created that little bowl, and then planted it with plants. And now it no longer floods there. Instead, the plants drink that up. And also, I forgot to mention those plants' deep, extensive root systems can also help decompact that soil. So when we were first trying to plant this garden, we tried sillily, I forgot the word I was trying to say, to dig into the ground ourselves with the shovel, and then we found that was way too hard, and we had to get a little machine to dig it out because we think that might have been kind of like overflow parking at some point from the parking lot. So it was compacted. It was basically just rock. So yeah, those plants being there with those roots are gonna, break apart that soil slowly and decompact that and make it healthier. So another thing, since we were talking so much about how, well, one, that Pennington is at the headwater area of a certain watershed of the Woolsey Brook, um, and that, just streams are within this town. Riparian buffers are really important. So Steve had talked about, reconnecting streams to their floodplains to prevent that erosion that you saw where their banks are undercut. So on a residential level, you don't have control over the whole stream, but if you have a stream in your backyard or nearby, creating plantings that are between your lawn, your house, and the stream are really important. So you can see here, um, like in a perfect world, there would be trees and other types of plants, a minimum of 100 feet in width between the stream and other things. But anything that you can do to plant native plants next to your stream bank versus keeping turf grass will help prevent that erosion that Steve pointed out. Next, we have rain barrels, pretty obvious what those can do, and pretty easy to make yourself. Pervious pavement, I'll just say that this is a great picture to demonstrate the difference between pervious pavement and then traditional asphalt. So you can see in this picture, this is not anywhere local, but something that we found um, on the internet is that the spaces closer to us are pervious pavement. Parking spaces, the one that looks dry, and then the shiny part is typical asphalt where the water is flowing over it and saturating it. So showing how, in a very stark way, how great the pervious asphalt can be for reducing runoff. All right, so now that we've talked to you about doing all of these things, and we wanted to give you some resources. So I always recommend going to Jersey Friendly Yards. This is a great website that has a lot of information about native plants to get more of a background, but also a really great database that I have pointed out here up in their tab where you can go through and check off like what requirements you have for a plant that you're trying to put in your yard. The sun, how much sun you get, how wet that site is. If you are looking for a certain color or when it'll bloom, you can go to that database and filter very easily to find plants that would work well in your yard. Here are some pictures of the physical books that Brian had talked about. These are both about the same in content, but they're just by different people. So this is the Rutgers Rain Garden Manual of New Jersey, and then a rain garden manual created by the Native Plant Society of New Jersey. Both of these are great if you're interested in putting in a rain garden or learning more about managing stormwater. They're both available virtually. Another thing we always get asked is, where can I buy native plants? A lot of nurseries are starting to carry them here or there, but here are some groups that we recommend. And this will be shared, so you'll have these resources later. We can go to the next slide. I guess I will end on talking about, if you want to put in these gardens, but you don't have a green thumb to put them in or to manage them, choosing landscapers that have these ecological practices in mind is really important. So Steve, if you go to the next slide. Sustainable Princeton, a group called Sustainable Princeton, actually has created a list of sustainable landscapers and the services they provide. So a great thing to Google and find a landscaper with the same ecological mindset. Finally, I'll talk about the program that I run at the watershed called the River Friendly Program, which is as Kieran said, focused on getting people to learn more about their local watershed, become more environmentally literate, and encourage habit change and action. So if you go to the next slide. Yeah, we have programs for individuals to groups because we know that they each have different impacts on the watershed, and then we work with them accordingly. If you want to become a river-friendly resident, we have the QR code here to take the survey as a way to see how you're doing, learn new actions that you can do at home as well. All right, so is green infrastructure effective? Steve showed you the stats before. Just to reiterate, if we all did this together, one by one rain garden per backyard or more, we can all make an impact that will be cumulative. So I will leave it with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olivia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think each of you've conveyed something. I think we've got a lot here that we can showcase with our community even more broadly than through this community conversation. So I hope people have found this helpful. I think taken together, we've really heard from Brian around how rainwater moves through Pennington and our watershed. We've heard about what stormwater is and why it matters. We've talked about what the borough is doing. GP has talked about what the borough is doing and planning at a high level, and we will, love to share more information over time about those things. And Steve and Olivia have taken us through practical steps and context around what we can do and why we can do it. So I think this has been a really useful use of our time to sort of learn these things. And I'd like to, at this point, see if there are any questions or observations or thoughts that people have. And so as we move into that part of the agenda, we want to make sure that if you can, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom. I think everyone's familiar with that, and GP can let you in, and love to hear if you have any, even if it's observations or thoughts that this maybe have started. I would love to hear any feedback from folks. Maybe as people are sort of thinking about that, I was thinking, and Olivia, we as an environmental commission partnered with the Pennington School last year on a pilot project where we worked with them on planting plants in what they call the health strips, the strips of grass between the road and the pavement. And I think we'd love to sort of share that with the community at the right occasion. But I was thinking a little bit more broadly from your perspective, just working in the region. What changes are you seeing over time in our Pennington and this watershed when it comes to wildlife and plants? Are you seeing any changes to that residents may not necessarily associate with rainwater and runoff that are impacting us locally here?
Kieran, we have one participant with a raised hand, Deborah's iPhone. I would ask Deborah's iPhone to unmute and
Yes.
Contribute.
Can you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes, we can.
Oh, terrific, terrific. So my name is Deborah Milioresis, and I do not live in the Pennington Borough. However, I do live in Hopewell Township. My residence is 10 Flower Hill Terrace. I live right off of Bull Run Road. And currently, our neighborhood, Flower Hill, and our neighbors in Ewing are becoming more active within our community. We are surrounded by the Shabakunk Creek, and my township, which is Hopewell, is trying to put in extensive housing along Bull Run Road. We've also seen one large development, Woodbot Forge, go up on Federal City, which has dramatically increased runoff in our community. The creek runs through 74 acres that surrounds our neighborhoods. So I joined in, as well as my neighbor Devin from Ewing, just to hear what Pennington has to say and how Pennington, the locals are trying to mitigate water and trying to become more liaisons for the protection of our watershed. Our township, Hopewell, isn't quite, I've said it on a bajillion meetings at this point, but they are not quite as eloquent as you guys are. And I'm just hoping to educate myself better. I'm hoping to make more strides for my community and to do my part to protect the wetlands, of which we have so many, and there's so few left that have been not disturbed.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you
GP,
now. Thank you.
you may have a GP, you may have a perspective on this, or Brian, but I think a lot of what we want to try to do is we want to start with educating the community, and I think these sorts of forums like this, whilst it's limited in the number of people that attend, how we can repurpose this and how we can use this to sort of spread the word. I think that's a major part of it. I think the other sort of things that we're sort of thinking about and looking at is sort of hearing voices from people in our community that have done this and done this well. And there are people that take this very seriously. And I think we can showcase to people examples. And we've already, on our environmental commission, have invited people to talk to us, and then they've shared, their perspectives on what they're doing. And I think that's a good opportunity to sort of share that. I also think, inviting stakeholders, inviting people, inviting our schools, inviting our kids, inviting the business community to take ownership of the reason why they want to do it. These are also things that I think all of these things collectively together, I think sort of there isn't one. I mean, I don't know of one. Others may have a perspective on this of one thing that we can do, but I think it's approaching this from a lot of different angles, and then that comes with the energy and the drive of people in our community to help be involved in something that they think is important, and that's what I hope we're trying to do with this. I don't know, GP or anybody else, if you have a perspective on that. I think it's a good question.
Certainly. Let me just very quickly weigh in that in exactly the same way that the water flows don't recognize lot lines and tax maps, our efforts don't recognize borders of the municipalities either. So we're more than happy to talk to anyone from the township who has an interest. We're happy to share materials. We may even look on an operational basis if there are some shared services we might be able to split, best demonstrated practices and things like that. So there's a lot we can do to be good neighbors and good stewards together. It goes way beyond the borders of Pennington.
Steve or Olivia, do you have a perspective about what municipalities do in that regard?
I mean, so the Watershed Institute in and of itself, like I actually just literally texted our policy director because we have staff that keep track of these. I do remember the Bull Run Road development being raised by one person or another, but I can't remember if we've had a lot of input or any leeway there. And the towns are in a tough place, Pennington Borough in particular included, right? And there are some rules and regulations that guide how much housing and what types of housing, et cetera. And they're not, in some ways there's nothing they can do to change those. They can always make their own internal ordinances stronger than the state guidelines, but they can't not at least achieve the state guidelines there. And so I'm actually getting an answer from Mike now. I mean, I do know for sure it's part of, and I think maybe Deborah mentioned this, it's part of their affordable housing. But the one thing that you can do, within your own township is push for things like why are we developing there when we already have developed area, area that's already impact considered runoff. We can redevelop that area into those affordable housing we need. And when we do it with the least amount of environmental impact. The Watershed Institute, um, Pennington, and anybody who is trying to do it well is getting some experience. Everybody who's trying to manage and meet their requirements for MS4 permits, et cetera, like they're learning what needs to be done. Any town that is experiencing significant flooding, or issues with their water quality, they're the ones that are being forced to sit up and listen. But also, if enough voices speak up and say we don't want that there because of this reason, we know, we recognize that there are other areas within the township that this affordable housing can be done, that with a lot less impact to the environment as a whole, then they have to listen. But a lot of the times the towns are trying to find a fine line between what's doable, and what the residents are asking for, and that does track back to what Kieran and GP were saying, which is, the awareness and the engagement and literacy of the whole thing is, you know, I don't believe there are very many of us that are like, I want to do this because it will ruin the environment, right? It's going to ruin our water, and we don't actually care. We literally don't care about the people downstream from us. I don't think most people think that way, but people do have a self-interest. That's just human nature. And if they're not aware of what it means to build there versus there, and what it means to manage the stormwater this way versus that way, then they're not as likely to maybe choose the right option. So
Yeah, that's good.
Can
I'm just
we have a
conscious
couple of
time.
hands?
Let's go ahead, GP, see if
We
there's
have a
any other
couple of
voices.
hands. We have Andy J, and then we have Jerry Koblis afterwards.
So I'm Andy J, Andy Jackson. I don't know why it comes up as Andy J. My name in the system is Andy Jackson. But
Hi,
anyway.
Andy.
Hi, Steve. I have a question for you. I really liked that control project you had, or you showed, with the with and without the rain gardens. But I did notice that it was 0.71 inches of rain, which is a decent rainfall. But the thing that's been bothering me, and I've probably talked about this before, is we use this general term stormwater for everything, which can go from a light rain to a medium rain. I would call that 0.71 to be somewhere medium and heavy, but then we have a light storm, a medium storm, and then we have the superstorms. Like Ida dropped 8 inches of rain in 2 3 hour periods were very close together, 6 hours. What would that control project have looked like with 8 inches of rain in 6 hours? Would there be any differentiation at all, or would it be totally overwhelmed? Because I think we
That's a
need to
good
think.
question.
I think we need to think
Steve,
between.
Steve, could I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
We're running up against time here, so if you could just very quickly answer that, and then maybe we can squeeze one more question in, and perhaps we can follow up with Andy on.
Yeah, the answer to that is, I went right on past it. The answer to that is that there will always be a storm that these types of projects won't handle, right? And as Andy's familiar with, Andy's working really closely with us, Brian, Pennington, the county on that 31 Delaware intersection area problem, and trying to come up with solutions. And as he knows really well at this point, this one was, a point. This was only a half-inch rain. This was only a 0.71-inch rain, right? And that's still pretty impressive. But when you get 3/4 of an inch of rain every 5 minutes, like we did during that storm for short periods of time, it's going to flow way too fast for anything to handle it. And it's then when you have to take all things into account. So it is always a good thing to reduce the amount of water getting to a certain point. That's a problem point with these types of things, because it will do some good, but it will not completely mitigate a monster storm flood. And so when we are dealing with high level issues like that, like what happens when everything when these are not enough, there has to be a fail safe for that. And Andy's actually very good at looking at that. Like, if we get all that rain at once, we need to have this much space for it to go to to prevent like a disaster. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. We're at 8:30 right now. Can we squeeze that one question in, GP, that you
Yes, we can. We
very quick
have
answer?
one more. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Actually, this is not really a question. It's just a comment, and that I already typed that in. I'm just so pleased and appreciative of the Pennington School, how they have taken the Lewis Brook Trail and been planting new trees there. And we really have a little microforest there, and it's just beautiful. And I'm just so happy. I love walking through there. I love watching the progress, and it's a wonderful contribution to our town. And I just want to remind everybody that we are a tree city. So there have been, with the blight with the ash trees, so many of the ash trees had to be taken down that I would hope that there'll be some consideration for replanting trees, because that's an obligation of being a tree city, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give a shout out to all the schools. Hopewell Township, Pennington, Hopewell Borough, like the Hopewell Valley schools are all river friendly certified through us. They don't, when you get river friendly certified, it's more about education than anything else. You don't have to put projects in, but they're all putting projects in. And they really don't have to. So it's amazing that we're educating our younger generation, and it's super hopeful to see the enthusiasm they put into that. And on the point of the trees, Olivia put up that stat about trees. If you lose a forest of ash trees, they used to drink 15 or 20,000 gallons each a year. That water's going to go somewhere, it has to go somewhere, and usually it's flooding something downstream. And so your point, it is not just a greenwashing sort of fluffy exercise to plant a tree. You just can't underestimate. I mean, you should have right tree, right place, and right space, and there's some education to be had there. But yeah, replacing our trees, especially as we start seeing more and more impacts on whole tree species, is really important. Sourlands have been a huge leader on that. And there was also a comment in there about a lot of organizations having a lot of focus and and overlap, and how do they collaborate? And the answer is that we do collaborate whenever possible. Collaborations get a lot more work done. We don't all have the same exact area of expertise or focus. And when grants come up, funding and bandwidth is always a problem. So when we can get together with multiple groups, multiple towns, et cetera, it's partly what the regional work we're doing with Brian's company in Pennington and all the Stony Brook towns. The more people that get together, the more likely you're to get funding and get really large problems solved. So yeah, the answer is we are as best we can for the moment. It doesn't always work, or isn't always possible. Usually that has a lot to do with bandwidth and funding, but when we work together, we kind of close that gap.
Fortunately, we're up against time right now, and I want to thank everybody for being part of this discussion and this conversation. I thought it was a very useful and interesting use of our time, and I particularly want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Brian, Steve, Olivia, and GP for being part of this, and I also especially want to call out a couple of people who've taken putting this together takes some effort, and I want to call out a few members of our community who helped: Jim Fugger, Nell Horton, Brian, obviously, Nancy Fishman. Thank you guys for helping make this possible. We will post this on our borough website as soon as we can. We will make the resources that we have available through this presentation available to our community, and we will touch on this throughout 2026 as we try to bring this to the forefront. And thank you again. Goodbye.
And thank you, Kieran. Just very quickly, not only will we make the information available through the website, but also contact information. We had one question posted to the chat about working with different organizations and how they might overlap. So please feel free to reach out directly to those experts, those people who are working closest to the questions that you may have.
And come
Absolutely.
and join our environmental commission meetings, and come and ask your questions to us directly, because we would love to hear it, and we will find the answers to the questions that you have. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.